Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Welcome to the next class in Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. We're going to talk about Eliphas Levi today, and he's the author of the famous Doctrine and Ritual Transcendental of High Magic, which is usually in English known by the title given to it by A. Waite in his translation, Transcendental Magic. And Eliphas Levi is, of course, the pen name, the nom de plume of Alphonse Louis Constant. And he's a Frenchman, writing mostly in the time of what's called the Second French Empire, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. I historically situate him. His dates are 1810 to 1875. And basically, he's got a few different phases to his career. And prior to the revolutions of 1848, he's involved in political movements, what we could call maybe the French left, or a certain type of Christian socialism that was popular at the time, and basically got mixed up in a whole bunch of revolutionary activities. And then after the ultimate failure of the 1848 revolution, although that has to be a qualified statement because things did change, but the prophesied socialist utopia did not immediately arrive. And Constant became increasingly interested in occultism and in the way that could provide a medium to continue his speculations with regards to human potential. And A.E. Waite, in his often rather disparaging introduction to his translation of the book, by the way, Dogma of High Magic, first part of the book is published in 1855, followed the following year by Ritual of High Magic, 1856, and these are usually combined as the two parts of a single work, and were written as such. A.E. Waite proposes or argues that Levi gave up his revolutionary political beliefs and became resigned to a more conservative political viewpoint later in his life, and that this is what his shift to occultism represents. There's been some very interesting, more recent scholarship done, particularly by Dr. Julian Struba at the University of Heidelberg. I had the good fortune to meet in 2019 when I was in Europe attending a number of esoteric conferences, and I had a chance to see him at some conferences in Finland, and also at the big biannual conference at the University of Amsterdam, where they have a department in esoteric studies there. It's folded into the history department, and the big scholar there is Wouter Hanegraaff, who I also got to meet at that time. Anyway, Julian's scholarship indicates that a more careful reading of Levi's works indicate that he doesn't so much give up on his socialist beliefs as recode or reformat them to communicate them in the context of what Levi calls occult science. So it's really a rebranding or a reformatting. And for political reasons, he is trying to fly a little bit more under the radar and has a kind of code language that he develops. But there is, in fact, no fundamental political break between the younger, politically inclined Alphonse Constant and his later works on magic. They really form a continuity of thought, although the philosophy that he's using to articulate his position has become modified. And in a way, this represents what the political philosopher Leo Strauss calls esoteric writing. And Strauss means that in a political sense. In the case of Eliphas Levi, we have an interesting example where the type of political esoteric writing he's engaged in is also literally a kind of esoteric writing, in the sense that he's concerned also to, he's both concealing or providing a kind of cover for radical political ideas, but that cover is also occult, is also based on a kind of engagement with Western esoteric ideas and an engagement with that milieu. So here, the clothing, the sheep's covering is also of the wolf is also it is also a wolf. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but let me go into some of the history of this period. So we've talked a bit about in this series stuff that's going on in Italy and also in Germany, particularly in a humanist context. And we've been following the trajectory of the Western esoteric tradition, particularly in a Protestant intellectual context, because that's the location where there's the most leeway to experiment with new ideas, because Catholic Orthodoxy in the Habsburg dominions, particularly the Spanish Empire, is involved in this thing called the Counter-Reformation and is extremely reactionary. And so the Jesuits basically control and censor all the media. And in the Habsburg domains, the Jesuits are the kind of intellectual shock troops for the Counter-Reformation, in a way that in France, it's the Franciscans and the Dominicans who are the enforcers of orthodoxy against heresy, and they're also the people who colonially, by which I mean forcibly, convert the various indigenous populations in the New World, a deed that shall live in infamy. And I know the Franciscans have usually a better reputation than a lot of other Catholic religious orders, but historically, this is a period where they're up to all kinds of evil things. And the chief, during the period of the 30 Years' War, the main French diplomat is a person by the name of Father Joseph, who is a close collaborator with Cardinal Richelieu, who is the chief of state, but basically runs the government for the monarch, Louis XIII, who is personally has a very weak personality, and is alternatively dominated either by Richelieu or by his mother. The two of them are rivals, and then Richelieu is able to get the queen exiled, and she goes, I think, to Brussels or something like. Anyway, she doesn't return again, and then Richelieu is basically running the government. And Father Joseph, who's a Franciscan, is feared throughout Europe because of the spy networks that he runs, manipulating everything to secure the supremacy of the Bourbon dynasty that rules the royal house that rules France, over and against their chief intra-Catholic rivals, the Habsburgs. And so there's basically this kind of irony to the religious wars that run all through the 16th and 17th centuries, which is that even though the Protestant kingdoms are smaller and weaker than the great world power, which is the Spanish Empire, the Catholic alliance is never able to militarily finally prevail, despite numerous battlefield victories and being able to keep the war going, is never finally able to prevail against the Protestants and defeat them and eliminate them as a heresy, like all the earlier medieval movements contrary to Roman Catholicism are politically defeated, whether that's the Cathars or the Hussites or the the whomever. And but Protestantism does succeed in maintaining itself, and indeed, even by the 19th century and arguably by the 18th, has overwhelmed and actually become the zone of where the world power and colonialism is increasingly centered in the British Empire emerging. Now, the French are rivals to that. They remain Catholic really by a kind of fluke of history that for almost half a century there's civil war in France between the Catholics and what are called the Huguenots, which are the Calvinists in France. Protestantism spreads rapidly into France and could have won the Civil War, and France could have become Protestant like the other Northern and Western European states. But although in many ways it is a Northern and Western European state, culturally and in terms of its trajectory of economic development and the increasingly the power shifts in Europe to different places in terms of how the new globalization under colonialism is coordinated. And so first the Spanish, the Portuguese have dominance, but then the Dutch move in, and then the English and then the French are able to all eventually gain greater economic strength. So there's a civil war in France, and nobles take on different sides of this, and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And eventually the Catholics win. And so that's why Catholicism, France remains at least nominally Catholic, even though it increasingly begins to, especially in the 19th century, begins to develop also as a largely secular culture as well. But at least officially, France remains Catholic. And then, so that means that they're at least officially supposed to be part of the Catholic alliance with the Habsburg, Spain, and the Austrians against the Protestants. But the Bourbon dynasty is rivals within the Catholic bloc with the Habsburgs, and the Bourbons want to dominate Europe and become the global power, and not allow the Habsburgs to do that. And so basically what happens is whenever the Spanish Empire is winning against the Protestants, and particularly this involves a lot of fighting in the United Provinces, which are now called the Netherlands, because that's originally a Spanish territory. It's a fief of the Spanish throne, and then there's a revolt and it breaks away, declares its independence, and for 80 years or more is basically at war as the Spanish continually attempt and fail to reconquer it. Meanwhile, cities like Amsterdam within the United Provinces are getting filthy rich off of trade, and this allows them to hire mercenaries and have a strong army and basically hold off the Spanish, although it's touch and go on a number of occasions. The area of the United Provinces becomes Protestant, but there's also a Catholic minority in the south, and so that's how Brussels and that's how Belgium breaks away as a separate and becomes a separate state, because originally this is all the Spanish territory, and then the northern part of the United Provinces breaks away and becomes Protestant, and the southern part eventually remains Catholic and is then called the Spanish Netherlands and then becomes Belgium. In case anybody's interested how this map, because none of these territories are natural territories. They're just interpreted in the later nationalism that develops in modernity, and they become naturalized as these areas that this area is supposed to be this thing called France. This other area is supposed to be this thing called Germany and Italy and Spain. And these are all completely artificial, ultimately artificial categories. So anyway, there's this struggle for power then between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. And so whenever the Catholic alliance is about to win, the French turn on the Spanish, and they're not able to win. And eventually this culminates in the 30 Years' War, where the French actually directly eventually side with the Protestants, and Habsburg power is broken. And then France becomes the major world power, especially under the rulership of the next king, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. But then everybody gangs up against the French because then they're too powerful. And so then there's various wars that occur. And then eventually the British Empire is then going to emerge as the victor from that. In the meantime, French culture and society continues as this new, very strong nation state. And then immediately the contradictions and instabilities of being a modern nation state come into play. So French society becomes completely hierarchically ossified, this thing called the ancient regime. French Revolution happens, that breaks up. Then the French Revolution, in turn, fails to achieve its goals and turns into a military dictatorship under this fellow by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he conquers a bunch of neighboring territory and declares the first French Empire, has himself crowned Roman emperor in Paris by the Pope. Famously, as the Pope is about to put the crown on his head, he takes the crown away from the Pope and puts it on his own head. And he's the first modern, you could say, military dictator in modern terms, meaning that technically his family were some kind of lesser nobility in Corsica, but he wasn't part of the French nobility. He was a foreigner, but part of a territory that was then incorporated into France. And so, for example, he always spoke French with a Corsican accent. But through his own military prowess, was basically able to take over the state. And this sets up a new paradigm for the future, particularly in France itself. So eventually, Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and there's the restoration of a monarchy. And this then is the period of time that Alphonse Constant, Eliphas Levi, is growing up. And also, this is the period of time in French society that's chronicled in Henri Balzac's The Human Comedy, this great cycle of novels and stories in which he has this panoramic survey of social life during this period and all the different classes. And one of the things that's interesting about Balzac's coverage of this period is that it's clear that there's a strong kind of a cultural underground going on in France, popular belief in all kinds of different things. Particularly, this is grouped around a pseudoscientific concept called mesmerism. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then eventually there's an attempt at a revolution in 1830 that causes the monarch to resign, and there's I think a new monarch who comes in, but the state restabilizes itself. And then there's a further Republican revolution, meaning an attempt to overthrow the feudal monarchy and replace it with either some kind of constitutional government that would involve a democratic form of government, either modeled on the United States or the constitutional monarchy that's was functioning in England already all through the 1700s. And indeed, England is a fully functioning democracy in a modern sense, although Of course, certain classes are excluded from being able to have the vote until the later Reform Bill um, in the 19th century, and this was worked out by the time the after the following the English Civil War, where there was also a restoration of the monarchy after it had broken down, and there was an interregnum where there was a military dictator, in this case, Oliver Cromwell. And what happens, though, is that the Parliament agrees to have the king back, but although he has the right to veto laws, the agreement is that he's not going to do that. He's going to let Parliament make law and run the country. And this becomes more formalized after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And then it's pretty much made clear that Parliament runs the government, and that the chief executive officer of the government is the prime minister, and that it's a non it's a civilian government that's usually run by commoners. And there is an aristocracy, but they continue to have a state function. But it's now that they're a kind of constitutional advisory body that in the House of Lords that doesn't itself make law, but reviews laws that are passed by the House of Commons, which now is the government of the what's eventually going to then become, by the end of the 1700s, the United Kingdom. So, but France is still stuck in the dictatorship of the aristocracy, and because that got restored after the collapse of the republic that was attempted to be set up during the French Revolution. So there's several revolutionary attempts to reestablish a republic. There's another one in 1848, and then what happens is that the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, a fellow by the name of Louis Napoleon, he's able to stand for election to sort of be president. And then he has basically has a coup, because the army supports him, and he takes over the government and declares himself, like his uncle, to be Emperor of France, and declares the Second French Empire. And this lasts until about 1870, when there's a war with the Prussians, and the Prussians basically beat the pants off the French, and there's a new Napoleon III, as he's called, is required to abdicate as part of the peace agreement, and there finally is there's another French republic that starts at that point. Eliphas Levi is writing during the period of this Second French Empire, where Napoleon III, who's basically this fop, who basically has parties at this court, and the society is decadent and stagnant, and there's no room basically for explicit political activity, and all of that has to go underground. And so Levi comes up with the idea to continue articulating his revolutionary ideal about the realization of human potential. But he gets interested in occultism as the means to undertake this this mission, this new ideal. So one of the dominant currents of esotericism at this time is called mesmerism. And let me say a little bit about that. It originates with the theory propounded by Franz Mesmer. He's originally German. He moves to Paris, becomes famous there. His dates are 1734 to 1815. And he promoted the idea of what he initially calls animal gravity, and then eventually the name of that gets changed to animal magnetism. And basically, under the influence of Newton's discovery of gravity, and there's also been the discovery of the electromagnetic field, and this is eventually eventually formalized in the theory of electromagnetism. But basically, this is a more further quantifiable version of what had been viewed as in the previous modernity as occult properties in natural magic. And so there's a whole bunch of speculation that now begins as to how science has now proven the existence of these occult forces in matter. And so basically, this is an alternative to a certain type of reductive materialism, which is now emerging in modern society, which posits the universe as a deterministic machine that is fundamentally inanimate and dead. And in contrast to that, you have the emergence of what you might call vitalism or idealism, which is a renewal of the originally Platonic and then magical Hermetic idea that the universe is in fact pervaded by an invisible, subtle ether or fluidic medium, which expresses itself as electromagnetism, but also in other registers, one of those registers being thought. And that any part of the universe can affect any other part of the universe through the manipulation of this fluid, living, universal, subtle medium. And Franz Mesmer is one of the first theorists of this. And he originally calls this animal gravity because it refers to like Newton's gravity as an occult quality of matter. And later then he renames it animal magnetism. He moves to Paris in 1778, becomes a celebrity, and he's concerned to offer a kind of, maybe what we would now today call faith healing. But the idea is that he would make different hand passes, sometimes with a magnetic rod, like this. And he would, his subjects would then be, he would also stare at them in their eyes. And this would cause his subjects to go into a trance. And then this is called somnambulism. And then they would be able to have certain visionary experiences, enter into dreamlike or other special states of consciousness. And it was alleged that there were other magical types of phenomena that would occur: clairvoyance, being able to see through objects, levitation, other kinds of things were alleged to occur during these sessions. And so that leads to the idea that through somnambulism, you can become a medium and then potentially maybe communicate with the spirits of the dead. And then this feeds into the craze for spiritualism that then occurs in the later 19th century. And particularly after the Civil War in the United States. And of course, there are earlier versions of it. And Levi is part of that earlier interest. He's writing the Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic just a little bit before the main break into spiritualism that comes slightly later. We're not really going to be talking about spiritualism today, but I just want to mention it because it's one of the major currents of ideas that are going on at the time. And then all the interest in these types of phenomena leads to the interest of medical professionals in studying these real physical and mental phenomena that do occur. People are able to enter into trances and experience unusual states of consciousness. And so this leads into the study of what's called hysteria by medical doctors. And this leads to Sigmund Freud's interest in the phenomenon. And then at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the development of modern psychoanalysis. And so a lot of what we today consider to be magic, or rather a lot of what was considered to be magic in the past, we now call psychology, and vice versa. And so that does raise the interesting possibility that psychoanalysis can be thought of as a kind of magic and vice versa. And of course, there's lots of people who do that, whether that's Carl Jung or Israel Regardie is very interested in this. And of course, Aleister Crowley at many points makes this fairly obvious connection. So these things are all part of the same conversation. And part of what's going on with Eliphas Levi is that he's basically rebranding mesmerism, repackaging it as what he calls occult science. And he's not the only person to do this. There's a lot of other researchers into these type of phenomena who write their own books in which they basically reinvent the wheel and restate this idea. And of course, we should be able to recognize that this this concept of a universal fluid medium through which occult operations are being able to you're able to manipulate or cause is an idea that basically derives from Marsilio Ficina's idea of the world soul, and his idea that natural magic was affected through the mediation of there being this, that the universe itself had a soul, that all things were linked through that soul, and that you could then affect things through occult properties like, you know, magnetism and stuff like that, or other types of sympathies or talismans, and work astral magic through this technique. And this idea is revived multiple times. We saw how Jacob Burma, for example, revives this idea that becomes part of the mainstream of Paracelsian medicine and therefore of alchemy. And then again, here we are then in the 18th and 19th century, and the newly emerging natural sciences in a modern form. There's then speculation within the scientific paradigm in that context by numerous figures, some of them more or less accepted by the scientific mainstream regarding these types of mesmerist, hypnotic, somnambulistic, magical phenomenon. Harold Bloom, the American literary critic, talks about what he calls the anxiety of influence, which is that when somebody comes along who's a strong, creative person, they attempt to, they want to come up with a theory that's their theory, that's their original statement about ideas and thoughts that may in fact not actually be all that original. Of course, they're rephrasing them in their own words, and so the style and the particular argument that they may be following is of course original, but often the more underlying ideas are not actually all that terribly new, but people will want to present themselves as being critics or as abandoning or breaking with a past tradition that they're actually part of. And you see this all through history, but it becomes particularly acute in modernity because of the, it's linked to the commodity form of modern society, where there's this need for everything to be constantly rebranded in the new market cycle. Everything has to be resold. And so in traditional societies, pre-modern societies, where capitalism is in an earlier, less aggressive form, there's a value given to the traditionality of authority, to it being old, received knowledge, that it's not new. So the philosopher Epicurus, for example, was criticized in ancient times that he proposed that he was coming up with new ideas, and that's hubristic to come up with new ideas. Really, you're supposed to just the noble ancestors have already figured everything out, and you just have to piously learn their wisdom. And that ideal all breaks down in modernity, where everybody's in a scramble to come up with a new theory that they can sell and get rich off of because of the technologization of society, the commodification of society. And so this gets all mixed up with science because science is also commodified. And so scientists are always trying to sell their theory by writing books in which they talk about how they discovered the wheel again, basically. So all this hermetic, magical, Neoplatonic, Kabbalistic stuff that goes back to antiquity and before is now yet again rebranded and rediscovered. And there's, a whole bunch of people during this period write their books that they're going to, phrenology is advanced as the new science that's going to make, make us all understand ourselves and then the utopia world. This is a period of what Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels refer to as utopian socialism. This idea that there's going to be a new society that's going to overcome the tawdriness of the commodity society that's replaced the feudal order. And well, it's great that the feudal order is going away because labor is becoming more fluid and mobile, and there's this new middle class that's emerging that is now available to be educated in a way that makes learning and literature and culture available to more and more people in more and more ways. At the same time, this effective commodity reification as a result of the new bourgeois capitalist society that's emerging is tawdry and vulgar and common, and everything is sort of sordid and dirty. And so all these idealists emerge, impassioned to lead humanity to the golden path, whether of to be offered by science. And so, of course, Marx and Engels are declaring what they're going to overcome the utopian socialism of the past that's failed, all this fruitless romantic speculation, and they're going to their socialism is now scientific. Okay, well, Eliphas Levi is doing the same. By the way, the Communist Manifesto was written in the run up to the Revolution of 1848. The Communist League that Marx and Engels were part of, that they wrote the manifesto for, was one of the revolutionary societies that was involved in the Revolution of 1848. And so this is a French revolutionary milieu, and this is the same milieu that Levi is part of. And so then, just as Marx is attempting to sort of further his own theory of what went wrong and how we can fix it when he's writing Das Kapital in the British Library, likewise, Levi is busy studying away in libraries in Paris to come up with this new theory of occult science, where he's rebranding mesmerism and grouping it around a series of new themes. So what's important about what Levi is doing for the future? Well, first of all, what he does is he reintroduces the role of metaphor and symbolism into occultism. And because mesmerism had tried to promote itself as natural science, it had tended to see the more symbolic or ritual magical aspect, even though when they're holding these hypnotism sessions, basically they're doing ritual magic. There's a ritual associated with the procedure. The person lies down in a certain way, certain words are said, certain gestures are made, there's a wand that's used. Mesmer would wear robes with magical sigils on them, and his apartments where he would see patients were done up as if it was a kind of occult parlor. So there's this whole magical performance around it. And yet at the same time, because of the scientific pretensions that are going on around mesmerism, there's an attempt to gain respectability by declaring that what you're doing now is all that magic stuff is superstition. That Kabbalah, oh, that's just Jewish superstition or whatever, and you don't. And so the symbolical aspect, the metaphorical aspect, is pushed aside, and there's a kind of scientism, or what we could call positivism. There's a kind kind of all the occult phenomenon or symbolism are interpreted in the scientific, literal way, and the metaphorical or allegorical aspect of, say, the symbolism of alchemy or whatever, is pushed more into the background. What Levi does is he has a kind of literary approach to the style of how he's writing his books that brings back in all of the rich symbolism and mythology. And so he's interested in tarot symbolism, for example. His big contribution is the idea that the 22 major trumps of the arcana of the tarot can all be associated with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and therefore that the tarot deck can be directly accorded to Kabbalistic symbolism. And so he's the first to popularize and write about that idea. That's all based around using then these visual symbols to then produce or invoke magical things to occur. So Levi says that the luminiferous ether of animal magnetism is this thing he calls the astral light. And the main thing about the astral light for Levi is that it has this visionary quality. It's not just like a magnet that it attracts or repels in this kind of more abstract way, or you can project your will. You can still project your will, but you project your will symbolically through the mediation of symbols, through the mediation of signs or signifiers that appear within the astral light that you can see with your what he calls your translucid, your visionary faculty, basically your imagination. And then through the application of your will and your imagination, you can then affect through the mediation of signs or symbols all these occult effects. And so the role of signs or signifiers within the astral light becomes the primary medium whereby, or mediating function for Levi, whereby occult effects are produced. Okay, well, that's important because then ritual magic, which had been practiced but in principle rejected by mesmerism, is then returns to being front and center to how you operate occult forces. But that also means then that the ideal of the magician or the magus becomes once again the primary ideal for Levi, is that the holy person, the sacred person who possesses wisdom and gnosis, is preeminently the magician for Eliphas Levi. And so what's so important about the doctrine of ritual transcendental magic is that he's creating the ideal of the magus becomes the really important thing for him that he's developing. And then this is then going to be influential on the Golden Dawn and also for Aleister Crowley. Now, what's also important about this is that means that he has this ideal of a kind of universal church. Again, this is what Levi-Strauss calls occult, calls esoteric writing, which is in a political sense, meaning that Levi isn't just going to come out and say that he's a magical pantheist in the Jacob Burma Ficino tradition. He's going to proclaim in his public writing that he's a good Catholic and is for the Catholic Church. It just turns out that the real Catholicism is not the exoteric faith that you go to church and they tell you about. It's within the exoteric true church of the Catholic Church. There's the truer true church, which is the inner church of the magical adepts that has always been secretly preserved as the repository of wisdom within the biblical tradition and within medieval mysticism. It's just that the esotericists know that. The Rosicrucian adepts are the ones who are into the secret that it's not the exoteric religion that is the truth, but the inner esoteric Gnostic core of religion. That's the true religion. And so Levi is basically opposing a kind of scientific Gnosticism to the pistis or exoteric faith of traditional religion. So that's why he reads the atonement is not important for him to achieve salvation. The development of the magical will creates the possibility for your soul to strengthen itself, to build up the astral body so that you can survive after death by identifying yourself with your higher divine self or aspect. And so, for example, on page 267, he writes, quote, "The destiny of man is to make or create himself. He is and he will be the son of his works, both for time and eternity," unquote. Okay, well, in a sense, human beings then make the God that they become for Levi through their mythology, through their symbolism, through their divine will. And there's isn't really a God of theism that's separate from that ideal. And so for him, the absolute is what he calls reason. But what he means is the reason of the Church of the Divine Man in the French Revolution, where they worshiped universal reason as the divine, were deists, and they didn't worship the traditional God of monotheistic theism. And so when Levi says the absolute is reason, he means that that's incarnated in human will or activity. That's there's not an otherworldly incarnation. It's this worldly incarnation of the divine absolute is reason in human will and self-actualization and realization. And he sees the kind of human potential that's opened up by these occult states of somnambulism or visionary potential as a way to open up human creative potential to, again, realize human potential in history. Is this what Ernst Bloch calls the spirit of utopia? And again, it's this kind of Christian spiritualist / socialist ideal that was predominant in the early 19th century, especially in French intellectual circles. Victor Hugo is totally into this. Why are people in Les Miserables having these like visions of dead people that like exhort them to virtue or whatever? It's this Christian socialist spiritualism that Eliphas Levi is merging with mesmerism and recrafting as this Gnostic inner church of the adepts that's gonna take things forward. A major influence is this novel by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, Zanoni, which was published in 1842. Here he is. And Bulwer-Lytton is actually a major figure in early 19th century occultism. His dates are 1803 to 1873. His novel Zanoni is an influence on everybody who's studying the Golden Dawn and Theosophy, and there's several ideas in it that feed into Levi that also feed into the Golden Dawn. I want to mention before I open to questions. There's also a few passages we might want to look at in Levi's writings. So there's several things in Zanoni that are interesting. First, there's the idea that there's a higher self that he calls the Agoides, which gets from Iamblichus, which is also what the higher divine self is called, of course, in Crowley. And this is the higher genius of the magical adept that when they die, they merge with after death and become immortal. And at a few places in the novel, one of the secret adepts, Zanoni, he invokes and has a conversation with his holy guardian angel, who's called Adon-Ai, Adon-AI. Well, that's obviously Adonai. So he's calling the higher and divine self the Agoides or Adonai, which is, of course, also what Crowley does, which is also what Anna Kingsford does, which MacGregor Mathers picks up to then have this be in the second order in. So again, there's this larger intertextual context within which these ideas, which derive from Neoplatonic philosophy, which are also the idea of the neshama in Kabbalah, which are then all of these ideas in this genealogy are then picked up and repeated again and again, and then find their way into Thelema. Jocelyn Godwin thinks that Bulwer-Lytton influenced Levi's interest in magic, not the other way around. And that actually Bulwer-Lytton is a major figure in the early 19th century transmission of occult and esoteric ideas, not so much through his formal membership in some kind of secret order, but more just through the fact of being an important novelist. And he was also a member of the British lesser nobility, was involved in politics. And he is also interested in mesmerism and spiritualism and all these phenomena. Godwin actually proposes that what's important about his involvement in it is not that he's an enthusiast, although he is, but the element of skepticism that he also brings to it. He's not. It's a little bit like William James, who was interested in seances, but he was interested as a skeptic. He wasn't just interested to show up and believe whatever was happening. So he gives a kind of credibility, at least to the study of psychical phenomenon at that time as a result of that. And this is also what Bulwer-Lytton is doing. He's an important public figure who, because he's interested in these esoteric ideas, gives them some credibility, even though that credibility is because of his own scientific methodology, where he's not gullible about it, but he is as interested in a kind of scientific and skeptical way. He wants to examine and engage with these phenomena. And when Eliphas Levi was in London in 1854, which is the year before he published The Dogma of High Magic, he's invited by Bulwer-Lytton to invoke the spirit of Apollonius Tyana, a late antique magician, to visible appearance. And there's this whole magical procedure that he does, that he describes, which we'll get to in a minute and take a look at. I just want to finish with Zanoni first. There's a few other interesting ideas that are in it. First of all, the novel begins with a character visiting a library, a bookstore rather, in London, and discovering a mysterious cipher manuscript that the owner of the bookstore sells to them. And when they translate the cipher manuscript, it's this novel, Zanoni. And of course, this is the origin of the idea of the cipher manuscript in the Golden Dawn. Is basically they've updated the idea of this cipher manuscript that's in this occult novel, Zanoni, but when they decipher it, it gives the grade rituals for the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So it's the literary source of the myth of origins for the Golden Dawn, this novel. There's also the idea of what Bulwer-Lytton calls the dweller on the threshold, which is the idea that when you're attempting to ascend to the higher planes of mystical attainment or magical attainment, that there's a kind of you encounter in vision this kind of ghost or specter that blocks your progress, that the amalgamation of all of your own selfishness and confusion and what we would now call unconscious neurotic limitations. And the idea is that you have to recognize that this is an aspect of yourself and therefore overcome it in yourself. And then you're able to advance spiritually. But it appears to you, even though it's a projection of your own unconscious, it appears to you as opposing you as a separate being as you're attempting to advance through the occult stages of attainment. And of course, this is updated in Thelema as what Crowley calls the ordeal of the Nefesh, and which he writes about, for example, in his play Tannhauser, and there's other places where for the Ruach to turn itself to the gnosis of the neshama, it also has to engage with this other part of the soul, the nefesh, which has to be brought into equilibrium before the ruach can ascend to contemplation of Tifereth. So you're rising up through Malkut. You have to pass through Yesod and equilibrate the vital energies upon the astral plane. And encounter the dweller on the threshold in the form of the ordeal of the nefesh, and overcome and equilibrate the automatic psychical forces before the full knowledge and conversation of the higher self. In other words, the lower self has to be brought into equilibrium for the higher self to then be able to manifest. And this is done through a more or less self-conscious process, which again occurs in Eliphas Levi as the ideal of the Magus, and they have to equilibrate their functions, but then their magical will has to be strengthened. And so the idea is that you're not supposed to just allow yourself to succumb to unconscious forces, which Levi represents as the elementals, the undines, sylphs, gnomes, and so forth, that have to be controlled through the sign of the pentagram, which represents the equilibrated whole person, governed by self-conscious will, which then brings the forces of the nefesh and of the confusing and beguiling images of the reflections within the astral light, which are brought into harmony into then the luminous attainment of the infusion of the higher faculties of the magical will. And then one is able to possess wisdom and act with power as an active agent in the world to bring about the betterment of humanity. Of course, this is in accord with the Rosicrucian ideal that you travel about and act as a healer, and that your profession is that of a healer of mankind. And then the other bit from Zanoni is there's these two different figures of the adept in the novel. One of them is Zanoni, and the other is this fellow by the name of Majnor. And Majnor is a hermit and a mystic who represents the inner life of mysticism, but Zanoni represents the outer active life of magic. And so he's portrayed as a cavalier. At one point, he shows up wearing armor and a lance on horseback. And so this again is the shift away from the more Catholic ideal of the mystic as the person who's the renunciate from society. And for Bulwer-Lytton, as well as for Crowley, as well as for Levi, the magician is an active agent in the world. And so the Rosicrucian adept is not sequestered from society where they might engage in magical retreats, but ultimately their ideal is social. And so this is an ideal of magical individuality, but it's an individuality which has this social activist component. And so you're supposed to engage in humanitarian and other types of activities. This is what distinguishes you from the high magician, the transcendental magician. The theurgist is thereby distinguished from the sorcerer of black magic that practices magic just for selfish aims. But there is hidden within also the symbolism of black magic, the ideal of the theurgic great magical agent Baphomet, the idol of the Templars, which Levi insists is actually a pure symbol of the alchemical absolute, the merging and synthesis of masculine and feminine polarities within the astral light, whose synthesis permits the great work. Okay, I want to pause for a moment because we're at 3:00. There's a number of other things that we can look at in the actual text itself. I do want to open for some questions and comment. Gone through a whole bunch of stuff, and let's touch base, see if anybody has any questions or comments or things we might want to talk about. Dan, did you want to ask anything or make any comments?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the book, the Zanoni, or that? Is that an actual text that is available?
Yeah, it's a novel. You can get it.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's sure to be online. I'm sure you can Google it. There was an edition that was published a number of years ago by the Rudolf Steiner Press, I think, has the current edition that you can get used. And presumably there's older editions that you can get. It's not so well known now as a novel that, but prior to the Second World War, and especially in the Victorian period, this was considered a major novel, and there were a lot of occultists who took this very seriously as representing the ideal of the magical adept. And Crowley often mentions the novel or things from it, as everybody from his generation who was interested in magic or occultism would have known this novel. You could, I mean, you could say that now our ideal of the magician is Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings from Tolkien. And so that's kind of, if you were before the war and you hadn't read the Lord of the Rings, your ideal of the magician would be this character Zanoni from this romantic novel from the 19th century by this guy Bulwer Lytton. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Anything else we want to talk about? Taryn, did you have anything you wanted to throw in at this point?
Oh no, I'm this class is so great. I think one of the biggest things that is so helpful is understanding the historical context of so many things, like understanding the order that things happen. But I did want to just throw out, like, as a comment, that Zanoni is, so if you look at the AA curriculum list, like all of Crowley's reading lists for all of the grades, and he has the big one in the front, that's just sort of like, these are all generally helpful things, and he subsections that into fiction and nonfiction. Zanoni is the first thing on the fiction list.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of cool that it's just it's like right there, top of the list. Obviously influential to him and his thought at that time. So that's cool.
Let's take a look at the passage in Transcendental Magic where Levi talks about how he was working with Bulwer Lytton to evoke the sage of the spirit of Apollonius Timaeus. So let me bring this up. Okay, here we go. Dan, if you could start reading, this is obviously the chapter on necromancy in the book. If you could start reading where it says, "We have said," and I'll tell you where to stop.
We have said that the images of persons and things are perceived in the astral light. Therein also can be evoked the forms of those who are in our world no longer, and by this means are accomplished those mysteries of necromancy, which are so contested and at the same time so real. The Kabbalists who have discoursed concerning the world of spirits have described simply what they have seen in their evocations. Eliphas Levi Sahib, who writes this book, has evoked and he has seen. Let us state in the first place what the masters have written on the visions or intuitions in that which they term the light of glory.
Okay, so this is the astral light. This is the universal fluid medium, which is also the medium in which our thoughts are occurring. So there's always a mediation occurring between the fluid that's in our head and the fluid in the outside universe. And so all these levels can communicate with each other. So now he writes, let me turn this around so we can see it. So Scott. Okay, Taryn, if you could read this paragraph starting, "Nothing can enter heaven."
Nothing can enter heaven save that which comes from heaven. Hence, after death, the divine spirit which animated man ascends by itself above and leaves two corpses below, one upon earth, the other in the atmosphere, one terrestrial and elementary, the other aerial and sidereal. One already inert, and the other animated by the universal movement of the soul of the world, yet destined to die slowly, absorbed by the astral forces which produced it. The terrestrial body is visible, and the other is unseen by the eyes of earthly and living bodies, nor can it be beheld except by the application of the astral light to the translucid, which conveys its impressions on the nervous system and thus influences the organ of sight, so that it perceives the forms which are preserved and the words which are written in the book of vital light.
Okay, so the translucid is the faculty, the spiritual faculty through which you can perceive the astral light. In other words, the imagination. And what is projected then upon the translucid through the vibrations that are passing through are signs or signifiers. So they're not necessarily to be interpreted literally, but they signify or have an allegorical or metaphorical relation to matters of fact which you can intuit through the hermeneutics of symbolism. So you shouldn't necessarily take your visions literally, is what Levi is saying, but they have some indicative force that you have to figure out through this kind of symbolic calculus. So he's also warning against a certain sphremerai, right? The religious enthusiast who just assumes their visions literally tell you what's going to happen. He's saying, look at the Hebrew biblical tradition and the Kabbalistic tradition where when they have these visions, they tell you something, but that it has this metaphorical significance. So if it says that this happens over, 10 days, well, a day is as, 100 years for God or something. So it's actually going to be 10 cents. You see what I mean? So it always has this kind of, or you'll see a statue and then the feet of the statue are made out of clay and it gets knocked down and that represents some particular empire. And then the different parts of the statue in the book of Daniel represent different dynasties, that sort of thing. So there's these three different parts of the self here that come directly from Kabbalah. So that's the neshama, the ruach, and the nefesh. The idea is that when you die, the physical body is buried and disintegrates, but then there's this the ruach united with the neshama then ascends to some heavenly realm or moves into some further life or is platonically immortal somehow. But the Levi doesn't go into too much detail about that. But there's this astral shell that's left over that's from the vital energies of the nefesh. So the nefesh keeps floating around. It's as if the ego separates from the unconscious, and the unconscious as this like continues to be like recorded on the medium of the astral light, like the sound that comes out of like a record, but the artists aren't there anymore. And so what you can still play it, and the shell continues to act and behave as if it was the person who died, even though the person who died isn't there anymore. So you're not, when you're communicating with the dead, Levi is saying, you're not actually communicating with the soul of the deceased person, the person as such. You're communicating with a kind of astral remnant that has a kind of echo of the original person, but that slowly dissolves over time. And so you can strengthen the remaining vibrations so that you can see it, but it's this kind of afterglow that's fading away. So you're just communicating with the shell of the person. And that's why it can also become klephotic in the form of these ghosts that can haunt us. That aren't really the deceased person, but are this obsessing remnant of them. If that sounds familiar, it's basically what Crowley says in his section on the astral body and remnants of the astral body in Magic and Theory and Practice, where he repeats many of the points that Levi is making in this chapter get repeated in MTP. Dan, if you could pick up where he says, when a man has lived well.
When a man has lived well, the astral body evaporates, like a pure incense ascending towards the superior regions. But should he have lived in sin, his astral body, which holds him prisoner, still seeks the object of its passions and wishes to return to life. It torments the dreams of young girls, bathes in streams of spilt blood, and floats about the places where the pleasures of its life elapsed. It watches over treasures which it possessed and buried. It expends itself in painful efforts to make fresh material organs and so live again. But but the stars draw it up and absorb it. It feels its intelligence weaken, its memory gradually vanishes, all its being dissolves. Its former vices rise up before it, assume monstrous shapes, and pursue it. They attack and devour it. The unfortunate creature thus loses successively all the members which have ministered to his iniquities.
And so on and so forth. So I'm going to interrupt Levy here because he does have this tendency, it's very much a romantic tendency to go on and on. Let's look forward, though, to this next page. Taryn, if you could pick up where it says, in the spring of the year 1854.
In the spring of the year 1854, I had undertaken a journey to London that I might escape from internal disquietude and devote myself without interruption to science. I had letters of introduction to persons of eminence who were anxious for revelations from the supernatural world. I made the acquaintance of several and discovered in them, amidst much that was courteous, a depth of indifference or trifling. They asked me forthwith to work wonders, as if I were a charlatan, and I was somewhat discouraged, for, to speak frankly, far from being inclined to initiate others into the mysteries of ceremonial magic, I had shrunk all along from its illusions and weariness. Moreover, such ceremonies necessitated an equipment which would be expensive and hard to collect. I buried myself, therefore, in the study of the transcendent Kabbalah, and troubled no further about English adepts. When returning one day to my hotel, I found a note awaiting me.
Dan, if you'll pick up at that point.
This note contained half of a card divided transversely, on which I recognized at once the seal of Solomon. It was accompanied by a small sheet of paper on which these words were penciled: "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the front of Westminster Abbey, the second half of this card will be given you." I kept this curious assignation. At the appointed spot, I found a carriage drawn up, and as I held unaffectedly the fragment of my card in my hand, a footman approached, making a sign as he did so, and then opened the door of the equipage. It contained a lady in black wearing a thick veil. She motioned to me to take a seat beside her, showing me at the same time the other half of the card. The door closed, the carriage drove off, and the lady raising her veil, I saw that my appointment. Sorry, lost it for a minute.
Right where the cursor are.
Okay. I saw that my appointment was with an elderly person having gray eyebrows and black eyes of unusual brilliance, strangely fixed in expression.
Okay, so we see we're in a romantic novel here, right? It's all right. It's a cult thriller. He's off on an adventure. Taryn, if you'll pick up where she says, "Sir," she began.
Sir, she began with a strongly marked English accent, I am aware that the law of secrecy is rigorous amongst adepts. A friend of Sir B.L., who has seen you,
Who could that be? Keep going.
knows that you have been asked for phenomena and that you have refused to gratify such curiosity. You are possibly without the materials. I should like to show you a complete magical cabinet, but I must exact beforehand the most inviolable silence. If you will not give me this pledge upon your honor, I shall give orders for you to be driven to your hotel. I made the required promise and keep it faithfully by not divulging the name, position, or abode of this lady, whom I soon recognized as an initiate, not exactly of the first order, but still of a most exalted grade. We had a number of long conversations, in the course of which she insisted always upon the necessity of practical experience to complete initiation. She showed me a collection of magical vestments and instruments, lent me some rare books which I needed. In short, she determined me to attempt at her house the experiment of a complete evocation, for which I prepared during a period of 21 days, scrupulously observing the rules laid down in the 13th chapter of The Ritual.
And that's his own book where he has some details about how you're supposed to do this retreat and a spell. And anyway, if this sounds slightly familiar, it's because this is basically the same thing that happens in Energized Enthusiasm, the text by Aleister Crowley, where he meets up with this mysterious adept who turns out to be Theodore Royce, who takes him to a sex magical ritual. And it's structured. It's basically a pastiche of this story in Eliphas Levi, which is itself obviously a genre pastiche from any number of romantic adventure novels. You take your pick, where there's some hero and they're about to go on an adventure. So it's all wonderfully done up into an account. Okay. Let me move forward just a little bit. Now let's go ahead and read this account of the, I think we've just got time to read the account of the magical spell, which will be fun, and then we can talk about it. Dan, if you'll pick up where it says the preliminaries terminated on 24 July.
The preliminaries terminated on 24 July. It was proposed to evoke the phantom of the divine Apollonius and to interrogate it upon two secrets, one which concerned myself and one which interested the lady. She had counted on taking part in the evocation with a trustworthy person, who, however, proved nervous at the last moment, and as the triad or unity is indispensable for magical rites, I was left to my own resources. The cabinet prepared for the evocation was situated in a turret. It contained 4 concave mirrors and a species of altar having a white marble top encircled by a chain of magnetized iron.
Okay, this is the magnetic mesmeric element. It's magnetized to cause the astral fluid in the room to become also magnetized and rotate about, swirl about so that it's energized. Keep going.
The sign of the pentagram, as given in the 5th chapter of this work, was graven and gilded on the white marble surface. It was inscribed also in various colors upon a new white lambskin stretched beneath the altar.
And remember, lambskin is in Freemasonry, where you're given an apron of lambskin to represent your purity, that you're an initiate. Keep going.
In the middle of the marble table, there was a small copper chafing dish containing charcoal of alder, laurel, and laurel wood. Another chafing dish was set before me on a tripod. I was clothed in a white garment, very similar to an alb of our Catholic priests, but longer and wider, and I wore upon my head a crown of vervain leaves intertwined with a golden chain.
Now, obviously, this is the garb of a pagan priest about to perform a theurgic rite.
I held a new sword in one hand, and in the other, the ritual. I kindled 2 fires with the requisite prepared substances and began reading the evocations of the ritual. In a voice at first low, but rising by degrees, the smoke spread, the flame caused the objects upon which it fell to waver. Then it went out, the smoke still floating white and slow about the marble altar. I seemed to feel a quaking of the earth. My ears tingled, my heart beat quickly. I heaped more twigs and perfumes on the chafing dish, and as the flame again burst up, I beheld distinctly before the altar.
Taryn, if you'll pick up on the next page.
The figure of a man of more than normal size, which dissolved and vanished away. I recommenced the evocations and placed myself within a circle which had been which had drawn previously between the tripod and the altar. Thereupon, the mirror which was behind the altar seemed to brighten in its depth. A wan form was outlined therein, which increased and seemed to approach by degrees. 3 times, and with closed eyes, I invoked Apollonius. When I again looked forth, there was a man in front of me, wrapped from head to foot in a species of shroud, which seemed more gray than white. He was lean, melancholy, and beardless, and did not altogether correspond to my preconceived notion of Apollonius. I experienced an abnormally cold sensation, and when I endeavored to question the phantom, I could not articulate a syllable. I therefore placed my hand upon the sign of the pentagram and pointed the sword at the figure, commanding it mentally to obey and not alarm me, in virtue of the said sign. The form therefore became vague and suddenly disappeared. I directed it to return, and presently felt, as it were, a breath close by me. Something touched my hand which was holding the sword, and the arm became immediately benumbed as far as the elbow. I divined that the sword displeased the spirit, and I therefore placed it point downwards, close by me within the circle. The human figure reappeared immediately, but I experienced such an intense weakness in all my limbs, and a swooning sensation came so quickly over me that I made 2 steps to sit down, whereupon I fell into a profound lethargy, accompanied by dreams, of which I had only a confused recollection when I came again to myself. For several subsequent days, my arm remained benumbed and painful. The apparition did not speak to me, but it seemed that the questions I had designed to ask answered themselves in my mind. To that of the lady, an interior voice replied, "Death." It was concerning a man about whom she desired information. As for myself, I sought to know whether reconciliation and forgiveness were possible between 2 persons who occupied my thoughts, and the same inexorable echo within me answered, "Dead."
Okay. And that's how you do magic. And this is one of the great famous literary artifacts from the 19th century about practical ritual magic. And so this is a very famous passage from the book. But I think you can see many of this close sympathy in procedures and spirit with our own tradition here. And this is very much the same, or at least a similar way that ceremonial magic is, of course, practiced today as well. And of course, as it was in some form or another like this in antiquity. So the use of the smoke, of course, is that theoretically, this is supposed to provide embodiment for the astral perturbations of the ghost to allow it to achieve physical appearance. Practically, of course, the swirling of the smoke and incense in the air, like looking into the mirror or a black mirror, provides a kind of like Rorschach, and you're able to psychologically project onto that and see shapes and forms. And so you can, in addition to your imagination, you can, through a kind of psychological projection, you can also see the spirit within the smoke or the mirror, as Levi says that he was able to do in this particular ritual. And then some kind of symbol occurs, or there's some kind of other interaction. You see that when the spirit is recalcitrant, he's able to use the sword to try to command it. I don't recommend passing out during an evocation ritual, because that's a sign of obsession, and it implies that you're going to get, it implies a negative relationship to the ritual or the result. And I would argue that it's better for the magician to remain fully self-conscious and emotionally possessed at all times. And in fact, I tend to, this is my own opinion, but I tend to have a low opinion of magicians who, when they're in the middle of a working and you're working with spirits, have to have a hysterical episode where they freak out or get possessed, or something has to go wrong, or they have to injure themselves or something like that. that's a sign of immaturity of magical practice for me. Now, of course, this was Levi's first magical ritual, so perhaps it's not surprising that he had some mixed results from this. I think maybe in that sense, it's a pretty good experiment. And also, of course, the results that are ambiguous, he's willing to write those up as well, which is also a sign that he's following a good scientific procedure in his magical working. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. We've covered a whole bunch of stuff. Hopefully we have some kind of quick conversation towards the end here. Dan or Taryn, please feel free to jump in. Questions or comments. We've got about 5 minutes to talk about what we've been looking at.
Go ahead, Dan.
So doesn't it, just following that part of the book, shortly state that this is kind of the end of his desire to do actual magical workings as an actual practice?
That statement needs to be taken ambiguously. Obviously, all of his, because Levi is somebody who's also in a way living the lifestyle, the Magus is a kind of sage. I mean, ultimately, he's interested in the theurgic communion with higher divine experience of the self. And so, in that sense, because that's the focus of his magical interest, the more thaumaturgic side of it, he has a relatively more academic than practical orientation towards. But as we can see from this example, he's interested in phenomenon and experiment. And so I don't think that this is the last spell that he performed, although he doesn't want to present himself as he wants there to be these sort of high magical qualifications around his presentation of himself as a wonder worker or a magician. And I think this is more the general reserved stance of the Rosicrucian adept, and not something we should necessarily take completely literally, like his frequent protestations of Catholic orthodoxy, which he makes throughout his writings, which I think are basically preposterous and meant to be taken as such. It's obvious that he's a Hermetic pantheist. Nobody who read him would get any other idea that's coherently and consistently what he's saying, but he wants to have this kind of public cover to what he's doing. And some of that involves the fact that when he's explicitly, which he rarely does do, talk about actual magical spells or workings that he's doing, he wants to accompany that with this kind of popular disclaimer, in case any of the Jesuits come sniffing around, that, well, but of course, officially, I'm a high magician, and so I'm not concerned with this thaumaturgic sorcery. But then 2 pages later, he's going to explain that the basic symbol of the witch's Sabbath, Baphomet, is in fact a cipher of the great work, is in fact a direct representation of the great magical agent, which he says all adepts in every age and religion have worshipped. Okay. Again, it's kind of qualified. Am I answering your question about how this needs to be read? It's kind of qualified.
Yes, thank you. Definitely makes sense too.
So it's kind of again, there's this kind of exoteric cover for this esoteric information that he's also kind of communicating at the same time. We've got just about a minute more. Taryn, did you have anything you want to closing remarks?
No, thank you. This is such a great class.
Okay, great. Next week, we're going to look at the Theosophical Society and movement, and also the importance, but also ambiguities of Madame Blavatsky in terms of her legacy, and also how important she is for our own tradition as well. But also, this is the point where real problems emerge within the Western esoteric tradition in terms of its self-understanding, with regards to this thing that we've kind of been mentioning but dancing around called colonialism. And we're going to talk about that and the ambiguities of that, but also some of the legitimate opportunities for encounters with other traditions and things that can be legitimately learned from that conversation at the same time. So anyway, that's all for next week. Everybody have a good time. I'll see you soon. Love is the law. Love under will.